You asked about some of the hurdles to mainstream adoption. I think a lot of it is tied to education, whether that is education of the building officials, what's in the most current version of the code, or what's perhaps in two versions of the code ahead that your jurisdiction hasn't adopted yet, but we know that are going to be coming.
Hey everyone, it's time for Design Development, your hub to learn direct from top professionals in real estate design, development, and construction. I'm your host, Renz Hayes, founding partner at H&O, lifelong learner, obsessed with high-powered organizations and the leaders that guide them. If this is your first time on the show, thank you so much for tuning in, and if you're a returning guest, can't thank you enough. Let's get to the show. Today's conversation is all about mass timber, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Ricky McLain, a mass timber specialist out of WoodWorks. The conversation today, we're going to figure out what's the mass timber sweet spot. Where did this craze start recently? Why is there so many conversations about mass timber? Let's learn about the industry. How do you design with it? How do you develop with it? What are the things we have to think about to really do so successfully? If you know somebody that's interested in mass timber, you get value out of the conversation, please like, share, comment. It's the only way to grow this community, and we want to help more people. So without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Ricky. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Ricky. Ricky, thank you for joining us. Can't thank you enough.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Renz.
You are a senior technical director and mass timber specialist at WoodWorks. Could you tell the listeners today, what is WoodWorks all about? Who do you serve? How do you serve them?
Yeah, absolutely. So WoodWorks is a national nonprofit organization that is here to be a free resource to essentially anybody that's designing or building a wood project anywhere throughout the country. So we support architects, structural engineers, and building developers, owners, and contractors. And we have a team of people throughout the country, so we're pretty nimble, and we're helping basically on a day-by-day basis a lot of technical-based questions. Working with architects on things like construction types, building code compliance, fire ratings, acoustics. Working with structural engineers on gravity and lateral design, detailing, connections. We also have a team of manufacturing partners that we can connect people with if they're looking for sourcing options, supply options. And then we also have a WoodWorks Innovation Network that's it's kind of a hub of allowing people who have experience to connect with potential new clients, or vice versa. A developer is looking for a structural engineer who's experienced with mass timber, or an architect who's experienced with mass timber. We have the WoodWorks Innovation Network that allows those connections to be made. So we do that for wood frame projects as well as mass timber projects. Our assistance is free.
What a resource. And could you help explain what type of resources are available through WoodWorks to help architects, engineers, and developers? Is it all like documentations or publications that are on the website? Is it events? Is it personal? What is it?
Yeah, we try to keep it pretty dynamic and varied to be able to help people where they are, depending on the types of requests or assistance needs that they have. So it's all of the above that you just mentioned. I would say the first and foremost, to me, the best type of resource that we have is our staff. We have a great team of educated people, again, located throughout the country. We have a team of regional directors, they're called. And so there's somebody close to you, no matter where you are listening to this in the U.S. So that's to me, the best resource is talking with those regional directors, because they can answer those specific questions you have. But in addition to that, on our website, woodworks.org, we have a lot of everything from what we call expert tips, which is kind of like a website-based blog article, where it's honestly those were born out of answering a lot of common questions that we see. The idea was we created something internal to have that on hand for the next time the question came in. Then we realized, well, hey, why don't we make this a little bit more formal, publish it on the website so people can easily access that information. So that's kind of the shortest form. We do papers, we call them solutions papers, or 8 to 30 pages long, focused on a specific topic. And then we do a lot of education. So once a month, we host one or two, like 60 to 120 minute long education session Sometimes that's WoodWorks speakers,
Hmm.
sometimes it's outside speakers, and sometimes it's a combination. Um, and then, things like videos and case studies and a number of other resources.
Yeah, it's a really cool flywheel of content and value. You make your team makes themselves available to anybody in the industry, commercial, multifamily wood projects, that's wood or mass timber. And then the questions and that those people bring to you almost generate all of your future content, right? Like you can see patterns, you can see like opportunity, you get vision into where the industry's going and what all the players are actually concerned with, and that feeds into all of that content.
100%. And it's been kind of a fun time to, personally, as I know a lot of us at Woodworks feel the same way. It's kind of a fun time to be involved in the industry too, because things have been changing and growing so much. So for context, I've been with Woodworks for a little over 8 years, and when I started, mass timber was very new. So at the time, it was a lot
Mm-hmm.
of like very early, what is mass timber types of education. But parallel to that, what we refer to as like mid-rise light frame wood construction was growing significantly, where 4 and 5 story light frame wood projects were growing significantly. And so the questions there were much more in depth, technically speaking. So you're exactly right. Kind of the content creation side, the educational resources side of things was on a light frame wood, based project. It's, answering the common questions around like detailing floor to shaft wall intersections. Whereas on the mass timber, it's like, what is CLT? So over the past 8 years, both of
Mm-hmm.
those have kind of had parallel trajectories where even more in-depth questions on the light frame side, as well as more and more people do mass timber, getting
Mm-hmm.
into more of the in-depth technical questions there too. So it's been like I said, a fun time to be involved in helping push that along.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, where did this craze about mass timber come from? I feel like you can't, everywhere you look in the industry across probably North America, the United States, everywhere you look, people are talking about mass timber and want to develop with mass timber. Where did this craze all start?
Yeah, globally speaking, it started about a little over 30 years ago now, in Austria, where, really CLT, I think, is what most people recognize as like the catalyst for the modern, what we call the modern mass timber movement. I mean, there are other products. Mass timber is an umbrella term. It encompasses a lot of different products, and there are other products that we consider
Yeah.
to be mass timber, that have been around for, I mean, glulam's been used in construction in the U.S. for almost 100 years. So, excuse me, it's really just how
Mm-hmm.
those materials are combined. And CLT, like I said, was kind of the catalyst for the modern movement. Um, but fast forward to where it started and why it started to be used here in North America, and particularly the US, was uh, about 13, 14 years ago. 2008, 2009 was like the first use of CLT, modern mass timber construction. It was really just a few projects at the time. There were a few Canadian manufacturers that, had been producing CLT, or excuse me, had been producing glulam or other engineered wood products that started up manufacturing of CLT. A few projects then start using that. More awareness gets around the fact that it's a, kind of what I call a new tool in the tool belt of us as engineers and architects for what materials we can use on a project. So it was a very slow but steady, awareness results in use, results in more awareness, results in more use. And it also came at a time when there was a lot more focus and interest in sustainability in construction and how we design projects, where, what a lot of people refer to as the green building movement, really focused on operational energy, right? How do we provide better insulated buildings, airtight buildings that have lower operational energy needs to draw down that side of construction and building use. But what was being overlooked at the time, largely speaking, was the embodied carbon of the materials that go into that building. And you can actually have a more immediate impact if you really want to look at sustainability as a whole, a more immediate impact on a project by doing something that reduces the embodied carbon of the materials that go into that building at day one, as opposed to what's your energy use for that building over the next 30 years. Um, so there was a lot of this interest in let's kind of focus not only on operational energy, but on the materials that we're placing into our buildings. And mass timber was, a great way to help draw down that embodied carbon of materials. So it was this kind of confluence of factors of the material starting to become available, designers seeking something, a way to design and build projects that was more sustainable from an embodied carbon perspective. And then, of course, there's the aesthetic. People love the look of exposed timber. So those factors and a few others coming together, in the incubator phase, if you will, like I said, 13, 14 years ago, really started to take off in the US, though, in 2013, 2014, 2015, when the number of projects
Mhm.
accelerated pretty significantly and has been doing so since.
Yeah, that's a great breakdown of how we got to where we are today in mass timber. And now, when we look at, in particular in the U.S., the IBC, the International Building Code 2021, adopted Type 4 A, B, and C buildings, which allowed us to build high-rise mass timber buildings up to 18 stories tall. Now, did this increase in CLT supply and sustainability, did that kind of lead to the change in the IBC 2021? Was like this newfound, I'll call it a craze about mass timber. Did that help influence, or was the International Building Code already talking about increasing the height limits for mass timber before the CLT production started to increase?
Yeah, it's probably a chicken and the egg. It's probably some of both, honestly, because if you look at the timing of all of that, the what was happening was I mentioned like 2013, 14, and 15 is when we saw a shift, in terms of its very slow but steady growth to a very significant growth. And so what was happening at the time in 2014, um, there was the US tall mass timber building competition, where that was really the shift in people starting to recognize that not only is mass timber another, like I said earlier, a tool in the tool belt of designers, but it performs very differently than, say, light wood frame construction in terms of its structural performance, its fire performance, and therefore it should make sense that we should be able to build buildings taller with mass timber as a result. But at the time, the building code didn't allow that. Right? We're talking about at the time the 2012 IBC. The 2015 IBC was the first time that CLT was even prescriptively recognized as a building material. You couldn't build taller
Yeah.
with CLT than other wood products, but it was just basically the code saying we recognize that this is an allowable building material. So that was the 2015 IBC. Also in 2015, in response to, like I said, this movement of architects and engineers and developers recognizing that it's possible to build much taller with mass timber. So they were going to their building officials and saying, hey, we would like to build this building out of mass timber. Let's say it's 10 or 12 stories. But the building
Mm-hmm.
officials, they couldn't point to IBC and say, okay, if you're going to do that, this is how you do it prescriptively, right? There was no code path for that. So there was interest and demand from the design community, but the building officials didn't have the roadmap to be able to say safely, this is how you can go about doing that. So
Mm-hmm.
in 2015, the ICC, the International Code Council, set up an ad hoc committee that was tasked with evaluating, are tall mass timber buildings safe? And if so, basically propose some changes to IBC that would allow us to prescriptively recognize that fact. So that started in 2015. That ad hoc committee met over the course of
Nice.
several
Did you play a
years.
role in that committee?
I didn't know. No, it was there was some representation from the wood industry, predominantly the American Wood Council, who really
Yeah.
runs the code side of wood use, and they're one of our sister organizations. So they were heavily involved in that, led a lot of those efforts. But no, I wasn't involved in that
That's
personally.
great.
Um,
I think you'd
so
be an instrumental addition to that team, especially to inform on building code moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, the committee is done with their work, so they met through 2015, 2018. They proposed the changes which were ultimately
Mhm.
approved for the 21 code. And there's since been changes that have already been approved for the 24 code. So it's kind of this constant evolution process as to what the next version of the code is going to allow. But I mean, if you just think about that, 2015 was the first time that CLT was even recognized as a material in
Sure.
IBC. 2021, now you can build 18-story mass timber projects. It's pretty phenomenal in showing that quick growth.
And in 2024, right now we can go up to, I call it 8 stories because it's limited by 85 feet, fully exposed mass timber. But IBC 2024 is going to permit mass timber fully exposed up to 12 stories, which is super exciting.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're seeing a lot of interest in
So
projects of that height, 8 to 12 stories.
to me, I really like mass timber in, especially we can talk about the constraints of developing with mass timber right now in North America, but for me, I really see mass timber start to be economically viable and really make economical sense where it's the most economically responsible way to build in that 8 to 12 story region. So to hear that in just a few short years, it's going to be approved to be fully exposed at 12 stories, I think is great for real estate development and really great for the mass timber world. So to hear your perspective, could you, through your lens, like where do we stand right now in terms of supply and demand in mass timber in North America, the US in particular, and like what kind of major hurdles are we facing before mass timber becomes really mainstream?
Yeah, I think from a supply and demand side of things, I think that it's been they've been following pretty parallel trajectories, I think, where um, if you go back, like I said, 2008, 2009, there were just a few supply options in North America. Now we're north of a dozen. And some of those suppliers also have like opened second facilities somewhere else in the country or, doubled or tripled their capacity at their existing facility. So the demand, or excuse me, the supply side is definitely growing, and there's some rumors about possible future plants opening. Also, we've seen interest from European suppliers importing their product to the U.S. or possibly opening second facilities in the U.S. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
from a kind of a global perspective, there's Europe is where mass timber started. I think the U.S. has quickly caught up to that
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the projects and the demand that we're seeing here, and really starting to be one of the leaders in terms of mass timber use. So definitely the supply has been growing with demand. In terms of like you asked about some of the hurdles to mainstream adoption, I think a lot of it is tied to education, whether that is education
Mm-hmm.
of the building officials, what's in the most current version of the code, or what's perhaps in two versions of the code ahead that your jurisdiction hasn't adopted yet, but we know that are going to be coming. What is the fire testing that's validated those future code allowances? A lot of it also is education of everyone from architects, engineers to contractors, and that all kind of centers around cost. Everybody wants to know what does a mass timber
Mm-hmm.
building cost, and how does that compare to what they're doing now, right? And it's
How
a
much
hard
is a
question.
car, right? How much does a car
Yeah,
cost?
yeah, it's a hard question to answer because everybody thinks like, well, that last building I did, 6 months ago was whatever, $315 a square foot. So what's a mass timber building going to cost? And it's hard to
Mm-hmm.
answer it in that context. I think you can you can start to provide some answers when you know more specifics about a certain project. But I mean, mass
Mm-hmm.
timber is not a commodity product, right? You can't say like, unlike you can design a structural steel beam and it's a W14 by 26, and you don't care who's going to supply that 14 by 26 because you know exactly what it's going to look like, exactly what it's going to weigh, exactly what the structural properties are. So
Mm-hmm.
there's some inherent knowns associated with a commodity product like that. Mass timber isn't that, and I think that to some people that's a downside. I think that creates some flexibility though, because that allows you to to understand the options for like the different species that are used. It's an engineered wood product, meaning you can optimize throughout the depth of a member where you use high grade lumber, where you use lower grade lumber. And from a holistically like a material resource perspective, that's efficient, right? You don't cut down a tree
Very.
and every single 2x4 is MSR grade lumber, right? So using an engineered product that allows you to use, again, the variation of high grade and medium grade and low grade is just better from a material resource perspective. So the fact that it's not a
We're
commodity does
limiting
allow,
waste, right?
yeah, exactly. It allows better resource utilization.
And so when you talk about the commodity product, your traditional or most common development project is a design, a bid, and a build, right? We complete a design, we put those design plans out for bidding, and then the contractor builds. How does that have to change in the mass timber world, given that all like not every species, not every manufacturer uses the same species of wood. They have different aesthetics. They have different manufacturing processes. Like, how does that influence the real development from conception all the way to construction? Like, how do we have to change?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because it does require change, and that's been one of the hurdles for widespread adoption is that everybody's kind of set in their ways, and mass timber is not optimized for that system. So essentially, what you want to do is think about um, bringing on a contractor earlier and bringing on a mass timber supplier earlier. So for a couple of reasons that I'll explain. So don't wait until you're done with CDs, then send them out to bid and expect things to go well on the project essentially. Can you do that if you had to? Yeah, but you're probably not going to have the best experience. So some of the general rules of thumb are bring on a mass timber supplier around, say, end of DD phase. What that allows you to do is a couple of things. Number one is, like I said, not every mass timber product is the same, is equal. So by bringing them in early, then you start to specifically understand, okay, we're working with this supplier. They have this panel size. 8 foot by 40 foot is their most efficient panel size to make. Can we make little tweaks to our structural grid so that an 8 foot by 40 foot panel is optimized for that grid? What species are they using? What structural grade of species are they using? What does that result in for a maximum span of the panel? Okay, can we start to make little changes with our grid to optimize that span? Um, Also, there's just like with all construction materials, there's some concerns about lead times, right? So by bringing them in early, that also helps you build in the production time for your project into their production schedule so that by the time you finish CDs, they're basically starting shop drawings, and then 4 or 6 weeks later, those panels are going into production. So it helps from a structural perspective as well. And then bringing in the contractor earlier is helpful for coordination purposes. With mass timber being, a lot of people refer to it as a kit of parts, where the benefit is that once you get things on the job site, it goes together very quickly. But in order to do that, you need to have a lot of upfront coordination work. So under having a GC or CM that can do the coordination of things like plumbing penetrations, coordinating all of
Mm-hmm.
the pieces and parts so that the mass timber manufacturer gets that full 3D building model, so that when they feed that into their CNC equipment that's cutting every piece of mass timber, they're getting all those things incorporated so that when it does get to the job site, that's when you have the schedule compression because everything's been coordinated ahead of time, and you're not drilling holes to run your plumbing or your conduit. You're just running that plumbing or
Yeah.
conduit through.
We use the coordination process. We try to draw a correlation to if you were planning a concrete building. No one wants to go back and cut holes in a newly poured concrete building, right? A
Yeah.
newly concrete poured beam, a slab. You do not want to spend the labor and all that effort just to create a hole. So you want to plan ahead of time so you can box out the concrete pour.
Mhm.
In a similar way, you want to do that for mass timber. It's everything CNC manufactured. So the idea of cutting a hole in a CLT slab or a glulam beam is very cost effective to do when it's in the manufacturing plant. You try to do that in the field. Don't forget part of the benefit of mass timber is its aesthetic. You don't have to cover it. It is a finished product. And the last thing you want to do is go cut a hole in your ceiling or your beam. Uh, and it's not that easy. They had to core a couple holes in 11 East Lenox through a 5-ply CLT with a core drill, and it was not that simple. It's a pretty
Right.
robust piece of structure, not easy to drill through.
And it probably it probably didn't look as nice, as the holes that were drilled at the CLT facility. So yeah, there's definitely some differences there
Sure.
too. It's interesting. I was at a job site, a CLT job site in Rhode Island recently, and they had several locations where there was a 4 foot by 4 foot hole in the CLT floor plates. And one of the benefits with CLT in particular is that it can span in both directions because it has laminations running in both directions. But in order, they couldn't,
Yep.
the panels there I think were only 8 foot wide, so they couldn't do a full 4 foot by 4 foot hole in the middle of a given panel. Well, they could have, but it would have required supplemental framing around it, and they wanted to not have supplemental framing around the perimeter of the hole. So what they did was they basically split the difference. So one panel started at the center of the hole, and then another panel started, halfway, basically aligned with the center of that 4 foot by 4 foot hole. So
Hmm.
thinking through things like that, so that then started to drive their panel layout from this 4 foot by 4 foot hole, which was in the middle of the building. So again, that goes back to manufacturer input and helping your design team understand how is it most efficient to lay these things out in such a way that minimizes things like supplemental framing and panel layouts and
Yeah,
panel
it's a great
dimensions.
example.
Yeah.
That's a great example. And to go back to a comment you made about when to introduce a mass timber partner is
Mhm.
somewhere around DD. We kind of call it an accelerated DD phase, but before you do that, you really want to make sure you're working with the right design team that actually understands how to lay out a mass timber building and how to design to maximize the benefits of mass timber. You're always going to get unique insights and input from each particular mass timber partner, but that doesn't mean you can start from scratch and just hand them a building that's laid out for your, say, a steel or concrete or even stick frame building and expect it to just work for mass timber. So you really want to have some insight and go into the design process knowing a thing or two about mass timber, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think that there's there's definitely some rules of thumb that apply across the board with mass timber that you can start to implement before you've selected that mass timber supplier. And we certainly hear about projects that say, well, hey, what if I have to competitively bid this project and I can't select a mass timber supplier early? What do we do then? I think that's a great point. So what we've seen a lot of projects do is, essentially um, identify who like some of the most likely suppliers would be, and then start to compare. Let's say you select these three,
Mm-hmm.
they all produce a 5-ply panel, slight differences in species and structural properties, either designed for the lowest common denominator or kind of take an average or some way that you can kind of hit the marks of most, if not all, of the options that are likely to supply for the project. Same thing with your spans, your grid. There's some common rules of thumb, like a 5-ply CLT floor panel, regardless of who you get it from, is most efficient span is probably going to be somewhere in the range of 15 to 17 feet. You can kind of start to use some
Yeah.
of those rules of thumb. And then once you
Mm-hmm.
do finally select the CLT supplier, maybe you have the opportunity to make slight tweaks. But you're in the right ballpark, at least.
Yeah, that's really great advice. Let's go back into more of your background. So you're a structural engineer by trade, right? Did
I
you
am,
ever
yep.
practice as a structural engineer before moving to WoodWorks?
I did. Yeah. So I graduated. I went to the University of Maine and I graduated and moved here to Vermont, where I am now. And I worked for a small structural engineering consulting firm for about 7.5 years. Um, the same firm, we were small. I don't know, had 13 or so people. We did both civil and structural engineering, so probably only 6 or 7 of us on the structural side. Yeah, and I worked there till 2014 when I joined WoodWorks.
What type of buildings were you designing then?
we were doing a lot of variation. So we didn't specialize in wood or timber. We did some of those projects, but I didn't have a specialty in it. It was a lot of custom single family homes for people that are familiar with this area. There's a lot of ski resorts nearby, so a lot of second and third houses, custom, very high end single family homes. Um, we did quite a bit of work for some universities, so it was a lot of 3, 4 story steel concrete construction, and then a lot of
Hmm.
municipal projects as well, like fire stations, libraries, those types of things. So scale wise, all, relatively speaking, pretty small projects with a variety of materials being used.
That's a great book of work. And and if you don't mind me asking, why the pivot from the traditional engineering consulting role to kind of being working at WoodWorks as a technical director, pushing for mass timber and being more of a resource to the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a result of a couple of things. I mentioned the firm that I worked for was relatively small, and I was running up against, as probably a lot of people do in small firms, questions about what's the future in terms of like ownership or having some more options in terms of a leadership role. And because we were so small, it was hard to make any headway with those types of
Hmm.
things. So, it was starting to do some exploration to see what other options were out there. I've always had this strong desire and really enjoy helping other people, working with other people, helping them. So that was part of it as well with this role. And then I really didn't know much about mass timber at the time. It had zero mass timber actual design experience. I had read a few articles and those types of things. So it also just was attractive in the form that it was kind of a good time to get involved into an industry that seemed to be very young but had a lot of upside, a lot of potential. Um, so I can't profess that I knew all of what the role would entail when I accepted, but I was ready to, step out and try something new. So it's worked out really well.
That's a great lesson for anyone that hasn't thought about their future of their career, right? Like you recognized some of the future aspirations you might have, and your current path didn't necessarily provide that opportunity. So you took a step back to really look at your options, and you found a new passion in your career, right? I think that's a really good lesson to take home. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in our day to day, the stresses, the demands of us from friends, family, our job, that we just get into a cycle of executing the day to day and forget to take a step back and think like, what do I want in the next 5 years? Where do I want to be? What do I want to be doing with my life? And when we take that step back, I think it provides a lot of clarity and comfort to that day to day stress.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And maybe if you don't mind, I can share a personal story that also really led into all of that, which was so while I was
Please.
still working at the consulting firm, so this was 2011, I guess, and then starting with 2012, I was my wife and I opened a very small brewery, actually operated out of our garage. It was really just born out of a
Have you ever
passion
talked to
for.
Jeremiah about this?
I don't know that I have. I should.
You guys
Um,
both share the brewing background. He's going to love that.
oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think it's
So you opened
also.
an actual brewery.
We did, yeah, yeah. It was very small. For those who are familiar with like the quantities, we were brewing. Each batch of beer was about 2/3 of a barrel, and a barrel is about 31 gallons of beer. So like a lot of like say your local brew pub is probably brewing on like a 7 barrel system. So we were 2/3 of a
Hmm.
barrel for each batch. So anyways, we were open 2012, like half of 2012 and then all of 2013. And um, it was also at a period of time in my career, like I mentioned, I was trying to figure out where I was with things, where I wanted to be long term, and did I have those opportunities with the firm that I was at. And I was doing this brewing gig on the side. It was basically me doing the bulk of it, my wife helping as well. But it was just all part time nights, weekends, that type of thing. So And then the other piece on top of this was we were pregnant with our first child at the time. So this confluence of things like
Mhm.
really forced me to do a lot of self-examination and say, because basically the brewing gig was not essentially making any money. You know, we were just reinvesting it back into the business. So it was not going to be
Mhm.
viable long term unless we scaled up a lot. So that was an option that we considered, you know, basically scale up that side of things and abandon the engineering career, um, or just kind of keep
It's a
doing what we were
capital
doing.
intensive business too, right?
Yeah, it absolutely is, both from a location, you know, the equipment. Yeah, there's a lot of capital involved there. Um,
Yeah.
so that was an option. The other thing that we could just keep doing what we were doing, but understand that it was kind of just a labor of love. We enjoyed doing it, but on the other hand, with our first child coming, it's going to be less time available. So ultimately, what we decided to do was to close the brewery, and I don't regret that at all. I don't regret opening the brewery. I don't regret closing it when we did. I think it was a lot of valuable life experience, financing, accounting experience,
Mhm.
um, interacting with other businesses type of experience. But kind of through the process of doing all that, I really, at that time, sort of like really made a new commitment to myself that I was going all in structural engineering, and I really wanted to be the best structural engineer that I could be. So that was basically the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, which, coincidentally or not, was about the time that I was first contacted about this position with WoodWorks, and we had some back and forth and different role opportunities, and then ultimately in September of that year, 2014, is when I joined WoodWorks. So from a timing perspective, it all worked out really well. But I don't know honestly if those opportunities would have been there if I had kind of done that, you know, reapplication of investing myself into the career, and making sure that it was kind of going all in there.
That's a great story. And I really like how you appreciate both opening and closing the brewery, right? Like those were
Yeah.
both active decisions. You learned a ton from the experience. You enjoyed what you're doing, but you recognize you needed something else for your future. So I commend you for that. And throughout your growth at WoodWorks, I would say over the last few years, you and I have really built a relationship on LinkedIn. Uh,
Hmm.
Oddly enough, right? You've been a tremendous resource to us at H&O, as a mass timber expert and somebody we rely on for everything in the wood industry. If we have something technically that we want to ask or anything wood related, we always reach out to Ricky. Part of why we know each other from LinkedIn is we've both invested in kind of personal branding and content creation. You're in your video studio today that you've built during COVID, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about like why you started investing in a personal brand and creating content and how that's impacted you personally and professionally?
Yeah, yeah, no, I'd love to. And this is I'm in a corner of my garage, which was the fermentation room of the brewery. So a lot of these things come full circle. Um, but yeah, I mean, I
Those
think,
are from the barrels.
yeah, yeah, right. A lot of it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is this desire to help people and to work with people. I remember a very specific point in time. I think this was it's either 2017 or 2018. I gave a presentation at a conference. I think it was like the Structural Engineers of Michigan conference, perhaps, or somewhere in the Midwest. And I gave a presentation on structural design of wood frame construction, and one of the questions that one of the audience members had was like a question that it was a very common question. I don't remember the specific question, but I remember it was thinking to myself, this is a very common question, and sort of like the expert tips that I talked about earlier on our website, like that was part of the genesis for that was the fact that many people have this question. There's got to be a way to help other people that aren't reaching out to us, but they also may have this question. So at the time, I started
Mhm.
doing kind of this series of like daily short tips on LinkedIn, where like once a day, I would just kind of go back through, what some recent emails I'd received. What are some common questions that we had come through our help desk, and just post a short tip.
Mhm.
Here's a common question. Here's the answer. Here's a resource to check out. Here's some further reading, whatever it was. So I did that for a while on LinkedIn, and then this idea, especially when
Love those
around the
tips,
time,
by the way.
thanks, around the time that COVID started. where it was like, you didn't get that opportunity to interact with people in person. That's when more of the idea of like the video side of things started for me personally. I mean, part of that is like, I enjoy consuming education through video. And so I kind of wanted to start that process
Mhm.
of creating some video to also help other people. Um, so that's really the video is really just a visual form to help spread those, expert tips, if you will, or commonly asked questions. So it's evolved over time for sure in terms of what form that is and what the videos look like and how long they are and all that. But essentially, it's that was all born out of, and it still is genuinely out of a desire to help people and help people get this information that can help them on their projects.
It's such a great vehicle to provide value, right? And I would say to add to the impact a video can have on personal brand or creating educational resources, it makes you feel more approachable. Like people get to know you by listening to you talk on these little tips, these videos that come along, the consistent posting, the you're visible every day, every week out there on social media. It makes you more approachable so that you're more likely to help somebody else. They might have learned a few things from you and now they want to contribute. They might just comment on a video instead of call you at WoodWorks. So you're getting it's a new vehicle for people to engage and react with you that might have less tension or less hurdles for them to actually get in touch, right? It makes you way more accessible.
No, absolutely. It's one of the most fun, like to me, honestly, unexpected but fun outcomes of that is, yeah, meeting somebody at a conference, and then they share, hey, I saw whatever video you did, but it's also been a way to make personal connections too, where I mean, I absolutely don't profess to know all there is to know about mass timber. I desire to learn every single day something new about mass timber, and so these connections that I've made with people through that form have helped me continue to learn and evolve and develop resources that hopefully through WoodWorks is helping people on their future projects because people are doing really cool, innovative stuff with their own mass timber projects every day, and I wouldn't know about a lot of that if it weren't for a lot of the connections made through that video format.
Even if you're an expert in your field, mass timber, engineering, architecture, that does not mean you have to have every answer. That doesn't mean you're like an end all resource for all answers, right? What it does
Right.
show is a constant willingness to learn and the confidence that you can develop competency quick or find a resource to develop an answer to any kind of challenge that you face in that industry. And I think you do that exceptionally well. I know from us, like any single problem we bring to you, whether you've experienced or addressed that challenge before, we trust you as an expert to help collaborate on finding the optimal solution to move forward.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I mean, I think that too speaks to not just me personally, obviously, right? We have an awesome team that has a lot of that expertise,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of times it may be nice because of say a given workload to get an answer, or excuse me, to get a question that you already know the answer to and can easily respond back to somebody. But I think it's
Mm-hmm.
also nice to get a question that you don't know the answer to because that forces you to learn, right? And to engage with somebody
Force you
else
to
who
learn.
might know the information or to do some more research on your own because I can guarantee if somebody, at least the types of the way that people come to us, if somebody asks that question, somebody else is going to ask that question in the future or a variation of it. It's like this. I heard a quote recently where it was talking about like risk and risk of the unknown. And it was basically saying like it's only
Yeah.
risky if you don't know what you're doing. So the way to mitigate those risks is to learn by experience, learn by process, learn by learning from others have done. So it's one of the things too that I really love about everybody in the mass timber industry is they're so collaborative. Like you and I have talked a lot
Mm-hmm.
about mass timber. It's not been a one-way street, right? Like we talked a lot about the East Lennox project and why you use the double beam system and how it's benefited that project. And in return, I've talked
Mm-hmm.
to other folks and talked about the benefits that you saw with the double beam system and what they could potentially benefit on their projects. So it's definitely a very reciprocal relationship.
Continuous learning. I don't think there's
Yeah.
anything more I look for in somebody I collaborate with at work. Like it is the single attribute I I regard the highest, right? It tells me there's a natural curiosity. It tells me that someone's a problem solver. It's someone that I know is going to continue to grow for the next 10, 20 years, and that we can really achieve something together. So, and I look forward to collaborating with you for a long time in the mass timber world. With mass timber, do you have any bold predictions? Where do you see the mass timber industry in the next 5 to 10 years? And what do you think are the keys to maybe getting there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know if these are bold predictions or not, but I think just based on what we've seen in the past, 10 months or a year or so, the growth of multifamily and the use of mass timber in multifamily has been significant to note. I think there's a few reasons for that. Some people will say that office is dead or office is slowing down because of COVID. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I do know that we've seen, quite a bit more interest in mass timber in multifamily. And part of that, I think, is tied to the second notable trend, which is the use of mass timber in taller and taller projects. Like we talked earlier in the conversation about, code provisions have allowed that to occur. So there's more kind of a natural path for that to happen. But just to give you some general numbers, like WoodWorks tracks all of the mass timber projects in the U.S. And we have a map actually on our website. We update once a quarter to show where all those projects are. So as of like September, there were close to 1,600 mass timber projects in the U.S. It was about half of those are built, and then the other half is currently in design. So say 1,600 projects, almost 200 of those are
Wow.
what we call tall projects, meaning, 6 stories of timber or more. Um, but if you back up just to the beginning of this year, that number was about 110, and now we're at about 200. So that number's almost doubled just in the past, 10 plus months of the tall projects in particular. So I think it's a marked
That's
growth,
really exciting.
yeah, that we're seeing significantly. So in terms of 5 years, I think it's going to be more of the same. It's going to be growth of the supply chain, more options. I know a lot of people have interest in
Hmm.
hoping to see more supply options kind of spread throughout the country. So there's, somebody close to you type of thing.
Hmm.
And I think that could be in the form
Yeah,
of,
a lot of the mass timber suppliers previously seemed like they were Pacific Northwest. Are you seeing a lot more distribution and manufacturing partners come to the Northeast or the Eastern United States?
yeah, yeah, for sure. And it really does follow where the wood baskets are, right? Where the timberlands are. So we've seen more and
Hmm.
more focus in the Southeast US, um, and then some
Hmm.
in Northeast Canada. There hasn't yet been one in Northeast US, but I think that's inevitable. There's been in the past announcements about plans that didn't materialize, but Maine has had a lot of
Hmm.
interest. Western Massachusetts has had some
Yeah.
interest. So I do think that that's inevitable as well.
Yeah, it would be great to see. Um,
Yeah.
and then I have two questions I like to wrap up every conversation with is what's your top book or favorite podcast that you'd share with everybody from this past year?
Oh, there's been a couple of good ones. I guess the best one for me is the one I started the year with, which is Atomic Habits by James Clear. I know a lot of people have probably read that, but to me, that was, it's just such a great way of thinking about making small changes and putting processes in place, systems in place, as opposed to big goals. But what are the small changes I can make in my everyday systems? I like the way he talks about habits, getting rid of bad habits by
Yes.
creating friction, making it harder to do those things. Promoting the ideas of good
Hmm.
habits by lessening friction. How do you make it easier, more natural to do those things? So yeah, to me, that was
Yeah.
one of the really transformational books in my life.
Yeah, Atomic Habits is a phenomenal read. It's up there on my list as well. James Clear says a lot of things great. My big takeaway from that book was your habits actually define your sense of self. They create your sense of self.
Mm,
And the example they share in the book is the smoker who had quit smoking, and they say I quit smoking. I haven't smoked in 30 days or 60 days or 6 months. The challenge there is they still I recognize and they identify as a smoker who does not smoke. The real
mm,
mindset shift is when that person says, I am a non-smoker because I do not smoke day any day. I do not smoke right now. I have not smoked. So their daily habits create their sense of self, their sense of identity, that they are a non-smoker. And that is like a pivotal change, right? And like your point to reducing the friction to the positive habits in your life, like lifelong learning. And part of why we have a podcast here is podcasts and audiobooks have been that vehicle for me. I listen to audio and like educational things in the car every day during my commute. I have to commute practically every day. And why not use that time? It makes it frictionless, makes it hard not to do. And it ends up being something you really enjoy and has a profound impact on your life.
Yeah, one specific example of that, I think you're absolutely right. And one specific example is I I may be saying this a little tongue in cheek, but here's what I'm saying. I made a $2 investment that I have confidence in the long run is going to return 1,000-fold. And what I mean by that is this $2 investment was I recently canceled my Amazon Prime subscription. I've had that for, as most people do, whatever, years and years. That was costing me 13
That's a
bucks a
bold
month.
move.
So what I did
Yeah.
was I canceled Prime and I started an Audible subscription. So my Audible subscription cost me 15 bucks a month. My Prime cost me 13 bucks a month. Basically said for $2 a month, I'm getting rid of some potentially fast shipping, even though here in Vermont, you don't ever really get 2-day free shipping. But in return, I'm gaining, I'm gaining so much knowledge, just been devouring audiobooks through this platform. So yeah, I think that is just like one practical example of like what I'm trying to do to implement.
Love that example.
Yeah.
The best investment you can make is in yourself, right? That's the one that's going to
Yeah.
return 1,000-fold for sure.
Yeah.
And last piece of advice for emerging leaders in development, design, and construction.
Yeah. I mean, I think to tie a few of the things we've said together is just to be curious, to be willing to admit that you don't have all the answers to yourself. There's a great book that's Who Not How. Find out who are the experts in the industry and make connections and leverage those connections. Don't make it a one-way street either, right? You want to have a reciprocal relationship. So make as many connections as you can, learn from those people, be willing to give back to those people. And from there, I think that's really where you start to grow your opportunities as well, because the more of those people that it's not just you're gaining knowledge, you're gaining opportunities, right? Whether it's a new job comes into the office or an investment opportunity or whatever the case is, that really just broadens your horizons and allows you to grow professionally and personally.
Love that. It's a great piece of advice and a good closeout to the conversation today. Ricky McLain from WoodWorks. He's a mass timber specialist, an amazing resource in all things mass timber, and honestly, WoodWorks for the wood industry is just an incredible resource. So we'll make sure we link in the show notes. Ricky, what's the best place to get in touch with you if they want to collaborate? What platforms are you on?
Yeah, I mean, woodworks.org is the best place. It has contact information for all of our regional directors as well as myself. And if anybody wants to connect on LinkedIn, you can find me there as well.
All right, Ricky. Well, can't thank you enough. I wish you all the success in the world and excited to see what happens in the mass timber world in the next 5 to 10 years. So thanks again for joining us. We'll have to have you again on soon.
All right, it's been a pleasure, Renz. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Thank you so much for listening. If you found any value in this conversation, please like, share, and comment so we can get the word out to more people. It's the only way these communities grow. We're going to really change the industry. We're a growing community. Would love you to be a part of it. Please connect with us. We're going to be on all major social platforms, LinkedIn, Instagram. So all those links will be in the show notes. Enjoy the day.
When you're running and growing a small business, you need different frameworks. You need different infrastructure to put in place. And I'll never forget, I think we were out on the golf course and trying to get stuff done while we were out there. And you were like, dude, what are you doing? You need to put some processes in place so that you don't have to be the one in the business for every single little aspect. Put the right pieces and the right infrastructure in place and the right people, giving them the opportunities for them to make the decisions in the right frame.